So, hello and welcome to this workshop. So we're going to start, and I think people will join at just just from now. So thank you very much to attend. I'm Julia Grimaud from I4CE, which is Institute for Climate Economics, and there is Thomas Bonvillain with me. And so we're going today to tell you a bit about the French experience about carbon certification, because we've been involved in a kind of several year project with lots of French stakeholders to actually create and promote, let's say, the French carbon certification framework, which is Label Bas Carbone. So I think this has already been presented to you yesterday. So here we're just going to give you a bit of history on how it emerged and what is the kind of overall logic and stakeholders involvement behind it. And then Thomas is also going to tell you about a study that we recently published to try and facilitate funding from agribusinesses and value chain funding, and especially in relation with what you can claim and the double counting issues also. So we're going to have a twofold presentation with these two elements. So some feedbacks from the French experience, and then this specific studies on how to facilitate funding from within the value chain for agriculture projects. So just before we start, I4CE, so Institute for Climate Economics, we're a non-profit association. We're a think tank, so we provide expertise, papers, on all economic and financial issues that are related to the ecological transition, and to public-private decision makers, and to also stakeholders from the forest-based and agriculture sectors for where we are here today. And so Thomas and I are from this forestry and agriculture team, and so we've been not only but especially working with this within this team for the past years on carbon certification and on this development of the French standards. So please don't hesitate to also put your question in the chat, and we'll have a short break for questions after this first side of the presentation, and then another one at the end after Thomas' presentation. So just to give you a bit of overview of the French carbon standard history. So I'm not going to present it in very much detail, because I think you had the presentation yesterday by Julien Viau from the French Ministry. But just to give you a bit of context. So of course, carbon certification standards have existed for a long time. We had the Kyoto standards, international standards like Vera and Gold standard, which are very well renowned. And since, let's say, 2010s, we also have seen the development of some domestic standards, so mostly run by public authorities, either states or local authorities, which can operate at national or regional level. And so the Label Bas Carbone is one of them. It emerged in 2018, 2019. And so why we decided to create such a standard, I'm just going to get a bit of history. Thomas, if you can just switch to the next slide, please. Yeah, thank you very much. And so how this started? It started actually in 2010. I4CE hosts two research clubs, research networks, with different stakeholders from the forest-based sector and agriculture sector in France. And so it gathers people from those sectors, public administration, local authorities, scientists, some representative of civil society. And the idea is to discuss all topics related to climate and forest or climate agriculture in terms of kind of scientific basis, analysis of how the climate policies actually impact or will impact those sectors, and the economic side, I would say, which was very much related to how can we incentivize emissions reduction or carbon sequestration within those sectors. And so this is what led to the discussions and the interest about carbon certification. And we could not at the time rely on the existing standards, whether they were Kyoto or whether they were international standards, mostly because of the double claiming issue. I'm not going to go too much into detail right now, but those standards were not really implemented or applicable to Europe and to France at the time. So we decided with a bunch of stakeholders in France, why not create own framework that is going to be adapted to our context and what we need. And we had actually the expertise from the stakeholder sectors, the different actors that really wanted to implement change of carbon compatible, I would say, practices in forestry and in agriculture. And at the same time, we had a lot of French companies that actually also wanted to finance local projects. And based on also the measurement of a climate impact, which they were not able to do at the time. So we said, okay, why not create these standards? And so we had launched a European project that I think you can just click. Thomas doesn't. Yeah, thanks. A European project that actually managed to propose a first draft of the certification framework for France and develop the first methodologies for forestry and agriculture, as well as test on pilot projects. And the Ministry for Ecology has been involved the whole time and right from the start, so that they could also then manage and really take charge of the standards. So today the standard is national. It's managed by the French Ministry for Ecology. And it's been operational since a little more than 2 years. And just so that we clear, haven't seen all the rest of the workshop, but we're really talking here about carbon projects, and carbon projects are implementation of practices, of emissions reduction practices, or improvement of carbon sequestration practices that are going to be compared to a baseline scenario. And so this is what we call carbon quantification, and then with the usual criteria, with the could be additionality, non-permanence, the traceability, etc. So I'm not going to go too much into detail. I'm guessing you all know this very well, but just so that we're clear on what is the French standard. And so today, in just a few words, that 150 projects. Most of them are forestry, but actually we had a lot of very small projects in forestry, and we have one very big project in agriculture. Well, very big, at least for us. So it's 3,000 farms. And there's another one coming. I think it's going to be 600, sorry, not 1,000, 300 farms. And the next one is going to be 600. So collective project for agriculture and individual smaller project for forestry. This is how the stakeholders got organized. And 11 methodologies approved that covers 3 practices for now in forestry, and a lot of practices and sectors within agriculture. And there's still to come more than 10 methodologies in development. And for now, it's mainly land use, really forestry and agriculture. And tomorrow, there's going to be also a bit more about, for example, biosource materials in construction. And yeah, I guess that's, and also on I'm not sure how you say tiers-lieu. Well, anyway, sorry, I can't find the word in English. So this is to give you an overview of what we are now, and it's still quite recent. Like most of these methodologies were approved within the year, so it's still a recent process. So the project are for now referring to the first methodologies, let's say 4 first that have been developed in the project, and the other one, the projects still have to be validated yet because they were just published. And so the ministry has launched an action plan this summer to try and scale a bit and improve the standards. This is really a kind of continuous improvement process. So first, to reinforce the standards robustness and credibility on reviewing already the first methodologies to be also updated with the latest scientific research, for example, to have a more standardized involvement of experts, and to also increase the environmental requirements. There is already, of course, a criteria for co-benefits, soils, biodiversity, water, but they are going to be also improved, at least in the forestry methodologies. And the second one is to facilitate funding. So there are also several actions to try and facilitate new types of funding, especially from citizens, which is not really the case today, and also to try and have kind of groups of companies to help have a pool to better finance projects. So I'm not going to tell you much more because I'm guessing you already might have had some information about that. And the last step is going to be, of course, what is coming at the European level. So with the Carbon Farming Initiative, with the MRV framework for carbon removals. And so we're really waiting for the official publication of the communication very soon. And hopefully in the next year, there will be lots of questions that the stakeholders are asking today that will be answered. For example, on the types of eligible practices and criteria, on the level of MRV precision that is going to be required, and mostly maybe on the type of governance, whether it would be like centralized at the EU level, whether it would be common guidelines and more decentralized governance relying on the existing schemes. And yeah, and then the funding modalities of public-private funding, how they will combine. So yeah, there's a lot of question in this, and what we do in France on our part and the ministry and the stakeholders is to try and make sure that what has been done from now is kind of well known and can bring food to the table of discussions on this topic, and of course try to anticipate also as much as possible what the framework will look like, so then we can adjust also at the national level. And so just now, to give you very quickly a few recommendations that, well, recommendation, thoughts, and feedbacks actually from the French experience from this whole project and discussion with stakeholders we've had for the past 5 to 6 years. One on MRV, one on funding. On MRV, yeah, this is kind of a reminder to say that when talking about MRV and carbon methodologies, there's kind of two separate sides. The first one is the more technical, like measurement and diagnosis, so which are the equation modeling to actually estimate emissions of an activity. And the certification rules is once you have this estimates of emission, how do you manage to identify the emissions reductions coming from a project, from an action, so related to the baseline scenario, to additionality, etc. So we're going to talk about both of these elements when we talk about MRV or carbon methodologies. And so just a few ideas. I'm sorry, it's going to be a bit of a list, and I don't have that much time, so I'm not maybe going to go too much into detail. Don't hesitate to ask questions if it's not clear. The first thing was, of course, so this is derived from a project, a carbon farming project that we've had also for the past 2 years. No need to reinvent the wheel. So it's, of course, to build on everything, all the expertise that already exists, whether internationally, in Europe, with more local also initiatives. And yeah, we see sometimes actors just starting from scratch where there are already a lot really on this question. So to be as efficient as possible and rely on the existing expertise. And the second point is maybe also, I think, would be a challenge or a thing to take into consideration also for the European framework, is to find a balance between having frameworks, and it works also at national level, but which have a broad scale and actually are really good for buyers, especially because it gives more visibility, makes the scheme more understandable. And for example, for multinational buyers, it's easier if you have a scheme that have a wide range of operation. And at the same time, you still want to have methodologies and tools that are adapted to local context and adapted to local actors. So we've seen, for example, in French, the decision was to use Keep2ER as a tool for farm diagnosis for livestock, for the carbon agri methodologies, and not, for example, Cool Farm tool that was not used that much by French stakeholders. So this was, for example, this choice of tools. And we've seen also in forestry the need to develop maybe even more local methodologies on Mediterranean forests, for example. So how to find this scale between something that is really gonna be adapted to local context, but still something that is understandable for big, I would say, buyers. And the other point, and I'm really sorry, it sounds really like a list, but is that we have a lot of tools and methodologies also existing, both in those certification schemes I mentioned, but also in private initiatives. And there is a lot of models, a lot of methodologies to evaluate emissions reduction and also soil organic carbon sequestration in the agriculture sector. And there is a need to kind of make sure we assess them properly, and that they are constantly updated to the latest scientific knowledge. We've had the debate, for example, on the no tillage practices, and in France they were not included in the methodologies because our reference study on the topic said that there was not actually a carbon impact. So, but it's used elsewhere. So it also depends, and they can be this need to also make sure that everything is quite evaluated and assessed towards the same scientific basis. We can go to the next slide. And the last 2 points, I'm going to go a bit quickly on the methodology and frameworks, is not letting uncertainty deter action, because within land sector, there's always going to be uncertainty on measurement, on non-permanence. And this has to be taken into account, but this, if it prevents, if we said, okay, we don't want to invest within those sectors, of course, this is never going to be the right answer. So the recommendation, well, what has been done in France is either go for no regret strategies. For example, in forestry, well, I'm not maybe going to take too much time to explain, but either go for no regret strategy. So even if we don't have the very precise measurement, we still make sure that it goes into the right direction. And at the same time, the discount rate also can be a tool that we used also in the standards to deal with uncertainty and still make sure we do not overestimate emissions reduction, for example. And which leads to the last point, which is the acceptable balance between MRV precision and cost. Because of course, when we go for very precise scientific measurements, on-site measurements, soil sampling, it can be also costly for project developers. And so had to find the balance between the level of precision that we want and the cost that it's going to represent for project developers. And the tools that were used in France for this was the discount principle also that was applied to uncertainty, to information asymmetry, and say, according, if we combine, for example, uncertainty and information asymmetry, we have the discount, and we make sure we don't overestimate emission reductions. That was for there are a few thoughts on MRV, and the last one is on funding, and then we're going to get the rest of the presentation would be also on how to on the funding of projects. The first point is the debate about the role of offsetting in climate strategy, whether it is greenwashing, whether it is relevant or just postpone actions, and whether should we talk about contribution, about CSR, but not about offsetting. And what the thing that also was an issue in France, and that we try to go a bit against, is that it was sometimes used by some project developers or some companies. Okay, if I don't offset, then I don't need to have a project certified. I don't need to measure the impact. And so, of course, this can lead to kind of race to the bottom for project quality if we don't try at least to evaluate the impact, whether on carbon, on biodiversity, etc. So our message here was to say that this debate on the role of offsetting should not prevent the project from going through an evaluation process, and that carbon certification is not necessary just for offsetting, but just for all like climate related project and impact. And then there's a bit to also go in the same direction. There was a study by Thomas here that he won't present, but you have the link later in the presentation, that showed that payment based on results are not necessarily more expensive than the obligation of means. And they compared carbon certification mechanism with the CAP, for example, and agro-environmental measures, and that they showed that if you take into account the whole types of costs, including the design cost and not just monitoring cost, then you don't necessarily have a scheme that is more expensive. So this should push also the forward the need to go more and more towards result-based payments. The topic of the carbon price, I'm guessing you'll know that very low carbon price internationally, and in France we have projects between 20 and 50 euros per ton. This can be a challenge for the financing, but still I think there's a whole also consensus on the fact that the prices internationally are rather low to have really good quality and also interesting project for project developers. So hopefully if we want also be serious about the climate transition, the price won't stay at a few euros per ton for the project, in at least in agriculture and forestry. And my last point, and I'm going to stop here, is the need to diversify and coordinate the different sources of funding for projects. Diversification, because as I said just before, there's not just offsetting. It's the most obvious because, well, this is maybe the most well-known and really targeted to carbon projects, but they can be also all the other types, of funding, of CSR funding, of sponsoring, and also, of course, public funding. And so here, the point, the issue that we kind of have was how to coordinate properly public and private funds for carbon projects. And we had an example in France with the recovery plan, and which in agriculture goes pretty well. There was a kind of separation between what the recovery plan could finance, what the carbon standard could finance. So it works pretty well. But in forestry, it was not really anticipated. And then we have two lines of funding that are kind of in competition. So the project developer has to choose whether to go for the recovery plan, whether to go for the French carbon standards. And really, it's not the most efficient also and better way to scale funding. And so I'm going to stop here and talking about diversification of funding. Yeah, you'll have some other resources on the studies and on the French standard here. And the rest of the presentation is going to be specifically dedicated to how to diversify the sources of funding for projects, and especially within the value chain. And if you want to get the agro-industries to finance carbon projects, what were the obstacles? And so Thomas will present the work that he has been doing with some of our colleagues for the past year and with a group of agro-industries. And just before, maybe, sorry, just before, if you have a few questions, I'm sorry, it was a bit quick. Okay, well, thank you for the comments. I don't know if you have any question yet. I think the presentation has been sent to the organizers, so I'm guessing they will put it online. But don't hesitate to write. I don't know if you have a contact somewhere, probably at the end of the presentation, but we can definitely send it to you. And otherwise, I'm guessing there would be on the website. So well, thank you for your feedback. And do you have standards for agroforestry? Yes, actually. There is, I haven't shown, but there is within the 11 methodologies. Yeah, okay. There is one methodology for agroforestry that is in development. I think she's going to be published pretty soon. I'm not sure he has been published, but for the methodologies, there are 3 methodologies on forestry. So afforestation and improved forest management. There is a forestry on hedges management. On agroforestry is going to come the livestock sector, the crops. What else? Sorry, I haven't all of them, but this should be about it. And one also about the material in construction. Okay, there's one more question. No, I'm sorry if I was not clear about the soil sampling. The idea is just saying that there is always a trade-off between MRV precision and cost for project developers. And of course, in the scientific side, we always want to go towards more precise, more robust. And I think it's great, but sometimes this is the challenge that we kind of had to face, is try to find the right balance. And sometimes maybe we can allow for an option that is maybe not involve soil sampling, for example, and just proxies. And then we know this going to be less precise, so we're going to apply a discount. So actually in the standards, there's this in lots of methodologies, options where you can go to the most For example, also additionality, the most precise and robust way to demonstrate additionality, but it's going to be maybe more complex, maybe more costly. And so we often, not in all methodologies, it really depends on the cases, we're going to have another options that actually is maybe less robust, that is less costly, but then we're going to apply a discount, and then the project developer can choose what thing fits best for him. So I hope that answers the basically your question. And yeah, thank you. So if that's okay, I'm gonna leave the floor to Thomas.
Thank you. Just put my mic back on and I'll get back to the presentation. So I hope you hear me well. Yes? Hello?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so thanks, Julia. So yeah, as Julia said, I'll tell you about a work that we recently published, which is called Promoting and Reporting on Climate Action Carried Out within the Framework of the Low Carbon Standard. Because as Julia said, we were really looking into the funding of the projects and how, if you want to, the LBC, the Low Carbon Standard, to scale up, how we can diverse the funding and make the project funders go a bit deeper in the financial label. So the study has been published within the Carbon Think Consortium and a European project with the Grand Est region of France. So I'll tell you a bit of the context of this publication and why we wrote it. And then the really case of financing and the issues around these cases of financing, and then some lessons to be learned from this study. We've been really discussing with a lot of project funders for the past 2 years, and there were a lot of questions that get back again and again. And so this was about the communication of projects. When I finance a project as a project funder, what can I say and do, and how can I evaluate my funding? So this was really the core questions under several form. Some stuff about Scope 3 emissions and carbon credits, about also the communication if you have different funders involved, or also the fact that you may have to distinguish emission inside or outside your value chain if you want to see a Scope 3 reduction, for example. So we've been building a working group with those funders, and specifically with agro businesses that wanted to fund a project within their value chains, and so that we design, I'll say, yes, efficient and really practical recommendation. So those questions arose because of two things, and the first one is that you may finance a project with a lot of different ways. So you see here on this figure the different actors that may be involved in the funding of low carbon projects in France, and you see that there is many different potential funders and also different tools, and each one of the tools can finance several parts of the projects. So this is the first thing, and the other one is that, and this first thing is quite or rather specific to the LBC, whereas the other one is mostly related to the international context of carbon certification. And this is all the debates that Julia mentioned about double counting, and that creates a lot of confusions. So what I want to discuss with you today is those cases of financing. And here you have the stakeholders of the financing. So just a farm where there is a project and the different funders. And so to understand very well what I'm going to say about the project fundings, you have to have in mind those three visions for carbon finance from the point of view of companies. So the first one is the oldest and is quite well known. This is carbon offsetting, which aim at achieving carbon neutrality for scope 1 and 2. And then you have also insetting, where you finance projects within your value chains for achieving this carbon neutrality. What was in the offsetting, you can claim, you can buy credits that are coming from anywhere. But in the case, especially of the agricultural sector, most emissions actually occur at the production stage. So if as an agribusiness, you have only objectives on your scope 1 and 2, the ambition is not very high. So there was a second vision that arose, and this is carbon offsetting, but with objective on scope 1, 2, and 3. And this is so actually more ambitious, and this is a good thing, but it creates new issues, and especially if you want to do insetting, because if you do insetting with objectives on your scope 1, 2, and 3, as 3 is your value chain, you may do some double counting if you reduce with the same emission reduction your scope 3, and then you do offsetting with this emission reduction. So the problem here for us is that when you want to get more ambitious, let's say going from point 1 to 2, you are in a way penalized because the context is not really well established, and you may get some criticism because of that. So this is one thing that we want to correct with the study, and to establish a context a bit clearer, let's say. And the last vision I want to mention is contributing to the climate effort. So it's no longer a question of achieving a so-called carbon neutrality, but it is really like I just put my action to the global efforts, and I'm okay with that. So for you to see what the funders can evaluate and how they can communicate on their action, we created the dashboard for the study, and it is composed of 4 indicators. So scope 3, as I mentioned, the emission of your value chain, and this has to be in your mind really different from the contribution and compensation, because scope 3 is like a photography, a snapshot for a given year of all the emission in the value chain company. So any change of that may not, it may, but it also may not be thanks to the action of the company. So this is the first indicator, and the other 3 are about contribution in a ton of CO2 equivalent. These are the emissions reduction that are enabled by the funders' action. It's a right to it shows your actions as financiers, as a funders. Sorry. You also have compensation in CO2, offsetting in CO2. It's the quantity of carbon again that can be evaluated for offsetting, and then contribution also in euro, because we think that companies should communicate in a ton of CO2 equivalent, as it is already the case, but also in euros. These are complementary indicators. So really what we say to sum up this slide is distinguishing the picture, which is the scope 3, from the action that are the carbon credits. So just an example for this. So you see the dashboard on the right. And in this example, the company X finances a low carbon project in order to offset its emission. So you see on the left the emission reduction on the farm in red. And you see that this part in red can be used as offset and in contribution, both in euros and ton of CO2 equivalent. But there is no scope 3 reduction because the project is not on the value chain of X. But this project is in the value chain of another company Y, sorry. And so Y cannot use the emission reduction for offsetting contribution because it did not finance the project. But as it is on its value chain, there is a scope 3 reduction. So in the publication, we talk about several cases, 5, 6. I'll not get into each and every one of them because we don't have time for this today, but I'll try in the remaining time to tell you about the three that are highlighted. So the first one is about an agribusiness that finances alone the entire project. And then an agribusiness that co-finance the project with another entity, whether it is from the agricultural sector or not. And the last one is when the state contributes to the financing of the project through grants. So the first one is really important, is when the agribusiness finances a project which is partly on this value chain. And this will represent most of the cases because it is quite rare that an agribusiness buy the entire production of a farm. But this precise case sets several questions because if you want to value your action as a funder, sometimes you, for example, wanted to see a Scope 3 reduction in your carbon assessment. But to do so, in order to do so, you have to know exactly how much emission reductions are on your value chain. And at the moment, it is not possible because you cannot allocate the emission reductions to the different production of the farm. The methodology doesn't enable you to do so. So this is why in this case, to manage the use that you can make of carbon credits, because as Julius said, offsetting is not the only use that you can make of carbon credits. We recommend considering that all these emission reductions are on the value chains. So what we say is that this emission reduction can be sold, but it cannot be used by the agribusiness for offsetting because it's in the value chain. So you may have double counting if you do so. So as you're not able to prove what is or not on your value chain, you cannot use the carbon credits for offsetting. But we are currently seeing if it is possible to enable this allocation by improving the methodologies. So as I just said, the valuation in this case is not on offsets because otherwise you may have double counting, and is neither on Scope 3 reduction because you cannot prove that the emission reductions are on your value chains and say how many. So the value for us is therefore in the contribution that you can say that you finance the projects and that the decarbonization of your value chain is thanks to you, but you can not do some offsetting. So this is what you see on this dashboard. You have no Scope 3 reduction, you have no offsets, but you can claim some contribution to the global effort, both in ton of CO2 equivalents and in euros. And just to show you if the allocation of the emission reduction to the production of the farm is possible, and if the company is able to trace the production of the farm, which is sometimes really difficult. But let's say we have this ideal case. You see in red the emission reduction on the value chains of A. So it creates a Scope 3 reduction and is available for contribution claiming. And in orange, you have the emission reduction outside the value chain. So you can do offsetting with this part of the emission reduction, but no Scope 3 reduction, obviously. And both, once again, are available for contribution. The other case I wanted to talk about is when the project is co-financed. And this is the question of double counting between Scope 3 and carbon credits again. Because according, for example, to gold standard, you should not generate carbon credits from emission reductions that result in a Scope 3 reduction. Okay, so let's say a fund company finances a project on the farm from which it shoots some of its product. Then it must not issue carbon credits from this emission reduction in its value chain. This is a recommendation that we think is sometimes problematic, and what's more, there is no clear consensus on this recommendation. So the problem for us here is discourages cooperation between the project funders, sorry, because everyone's want the ownerships of the emission reductions. And as Julia mentioned before, we really need, if we want to scale up the carbon certification, we really need cooperation between funders. And also the issue is that Scope 3 is kind of the realm of double counting, because if you have emission reduction on the farm, then all the companies in the value chains must reduce their Scope 3. So this is quite questionable as a recommendation, because in practice it's really not verifiable. Goldstandard or anyone else cannot go into the carbon assessment of every companies and see if there are reductions or carbon credits and where does it come from and everything. So what we recommend for this is to allow the issuance of credits in all cases, except one is the one I just mentioned before, is where the company wants to keep or buy carbon credits that have been generated from emission reduction on its value chain, because this is double counting, and this particular case should really be avoided. But otherwise, we think that carbon credits should be emission of carbon credits should be okay. And yeah, so what it allows to do and to do is for the agro industry to finance the project, but not going through carbon finance. Let's say just for financing initial diagnostics, for the project, and let the credit be sold to somebody else, so that from the point of view of the agribusiness, the cost of the project is reduced. And yeah, I'll go quite quickly on this slide, but the spirit of this is to say that when the states contribute to the financing of a project, let's say to a grant, this is not an issue, this is a good thing. Once again, from the point of view of the private funders, it reduces the cost of the project, and this is really something interesting, we think, and really not something that should be avoided. I'll go quite quickly on this, so you have some time for the questions. So the last thing I want to say to sum up all this presentation is that for us, the three key points of the financing of Project Carbon is being cooperative, because no one has the ability to finance all the projects that we need. And that projects should be financed by several funders, and trying to buy carbon credits, especially specifically on its value chains, can be a problem for agriculture, for agricultural projects. Sorry. Then you also have to be pragmatic, because this is the Scope 3 emission and carbon assessment, and the projects involve uncertainties. It's never be perfect, so you have to have that in mind, and don't take guideline rules that are too precise, or that wanted to be in the perfection of the verification. And the last point to that, the key counterpart, I'll say, because if you're pragmatic at the cost of some perfection precisions, you have to be really, really transparent, so that there is no issue about communication and the value that you are gaining from your project financings. And so, yeah, once again, also communicate in euros, because the price of credits, it's really variable. So even from one day to another, you have prices really different. So communicating also in euros is really important. Thanks a lot, and we may have some questions in the 5 minutes remaining.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Do you have some question?
Maybe Julia, you have some insight on this question from Peter?
Yeah, well, for soy specifically, there's no I'd say compliance target, but there is actually it's not really it's not really a target specifically on soy, but we have actually in the French low carbon strategy all the trajectory for all the sectors from now to 2050 and to achieve carbon neutrality in 2050. And within this strategy, there is so the evolution of different sectors, including agriculture, and there is also in the sink part also what is expected from soil carbon. So now the land, I would say the land use part of the agriculture sector within the inventories is emits CO2, and the idea is that in 2050 the goal is that it's just only removes CO2, and so for this there is a target. Let's say it's not compliant, but there's a target of how much the land, agricultural land, so crops and grasslands, have to contribute to the carbon sinks in 2050. And if I remember well, I think it's 15 million tons of CO2. 10 or 15, I'm not sure. If that answers your question. And I think we just have 1 minute left, so okay, I'm reading your question. Well, I'm not sure I understand. Actually, the land use. Well, the target actually is for the whole country. I'm not really sure I get the question, but the farmers they're gonna have or want just to follow the trajectory, the climate trajectory, so to reduce their emissions. And so the more there is incentives and political direction to reduce emission within the agriculture sector, the more they would be involved in these types of also practices. So for now, it is maybe you mean on voluntary basis, because it's voluntary schemes. Maybe at some point, I don't know if that's the question, but at some point, maybe the result-based payments mechanism will also be a kind of conditionality for public funding. But still, they would these types of schemes, the aim is still to get all types of funding possible, including private funding. So farmers are going to be compensated for the changes of practices and for the emissions reductions they generate. Yeah, sure. But to us, this is also maybe one of the questions that we will have to see with the carbon farming initiatives at the EU level, and how it is actually plugged to connected to the LULUCF regulation, and also to there was, I think, also ideas or to connect the framework for removals to the EU ETS. So this would mean also a compliance demand. So I don't know really how this is going to work at the EU level, but at the French level, we have the global target for the country, but still the low carbon standard is a way to get also private funding to help the country achieve its targets. So it all contributes to reaching national targets for France. And I don't know how this will work then for the EU, but maybe the same way. To us, it would not. It would be. It could be coherent, but still, that we go back to double claiming and the claim that the company can have. I don't know if so. It's yeah, I don't know if that's answers pretty well. I think it's a whole discussion actually at this point, if I understand it properly, related to double claiming mostly. I think we're out of time.
Yeah, sure.
So yeah.
Yeah.
To us, for now,
Totally.
it contributes to the target,
Mhm.
and it's the most practical way. But this is definitely going to be a discussion. Well, thank you very much for attending. And yeah, so you will have the presentation on the website, and feel free to contact us also if you have any questions or want to discuss further certain topics. You have the email in the presentation. And well, thank you for the invitation to speak here, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.